Yes. Hello, everyone. Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Runner Office Hour. Before I introduce Steve, let me just spend a few minutes just to remind everyone a few things. First of all, it's really important. I want to remind everyone the community code of contact. Here at GitLab, we strive to have a safe and inclusive environment for everyone. So please be aware that any disrespectful and offensive behaviors will be addressed. And if you, at any point, either through a comment or through a merge request or through any of our community channels, feel unsafe or threatened, please reach out to us and we will be there to respond and support as soon as possible. Again, this is the time. We are almost halfway there. The hackathon begins on the 31st of March at your local time zone and ends on the end of the day of 1st of April at your local time zone. So we're already there, halfway there. We have a lot of merge requests so far, and I'm really happy. Thank you all for your contributions. It's really nice. We've passed the 120-something merge requests already. During our last hackathon, the overall MRs were 167, so that's really exciting. In case you need support or help, or just you want to reach out to the community, you can find us at Gitter, gitter.im/gitlab/contributors. If you need anything specifically, feel free to ping me through here or through any of our MRs or issues. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce to Steve, who is going to walk us through one of my favorite and most successful, I'll say, office hour that we've been going on at GitLab for quite some time now for the runner. Let me stop sharing my screen and the floor is yours, Steve.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve. I'm located in Malta, and I've been working at GitLab for around 2.5 years. And I'm one of the project maintainers on GitLab Runner, which is the agent that runs the CI jobs for GitLab. The usual format of this office hour is we either have participants during the call. We can answer any questions they have or review to have them contribute something to GitLab Runner. Or if we have no questions or no other items on the agenda, I can do some live code reviews on community contributions that opened in the past, and that might give some folks some ideas what goes into the process of reviewing a merge request and trying to get that merged into our code base. I see one person so far, so if you have any questions or any merge requests that you want me to go through, I'm more than happy to chat with you about that.
Currently, I don't have anyone that needs to be reviewed. I mean, reviewers are already assigned to the MRs, so that's it.
Awesome. Do you have any questions in mind that you wanted to ask, or is it just listening so far?
Yeah, I was just listening, but I mean, is the GitLab runner the one that is actually running the pipeline? I mean, the integration tests that we write, that's where the runner is there?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because it's not very, if you're not familiar with the GitLab stack, it's not very clear what GitLab Runner is doing, right? Because when I first looked at GitLab Runner, I thought it was also parsing the GitLab CI YAML and creating the pipelines and things like that. But that is not the case. So to give a quick overview of the architecture, we have GitLab, the application, which is a Ruby on Rails application. And that is where all the data is stored, and that is what we call the single source of truth. So that is where the GitLab CI YAML parsing happens. That is where the jobs are created. That is where the pipelines are created. And then when everything is created, it will assign this specific job to GitLab Runner. And basically what GitLab Runner is going to do is it's going to get a specification for that specific job. So it's completely ignorant about pipelines. GitLab Runner. It only knows about one single job. it will get a specification of that job, and GitLab runner will tell it, hey, I need you to run this script and so with this infrastructure and so on and so forth. And then GitLab runner does it. Like it just parses that JSON string and creates like a Docker container with all the specifications, and then just runs the script for the user in one container, for example, if we're talking about Docker, or it can be Kubernetes, or it can be anything else. So GitLab runner is mostly somewhat of a low-level thing where the execution of the user script actually happens. The creation of the pipeline, the job, and all the magic that is GitLab CI YAML file, that is all done inside of the Ruby on Rails application, which is our monolith. Is that a bit more clear, or do you have any follow-up questions?
Understood.
Perfect. So let me share my screen actually. And I saw some community contributions coming in during the hackathon. So we have 2 so far. And it's always nice to see documentation changes. Those are like one of my favorite ones, mostly because they're super quick to merge and they improve the quality of life for everyone. They improve the quality of life for me when I go reference our own documentation when I'm trying to figure out the problem, and they help increase adoption. So we're very lucky at GitLab that we have a technical writing team where they spend like enormous amount of hard work making our documentation look consistent and with proper grammar and so on and so forth, which is something most developers don't always have time to do so. So we have this process where engineers usually vet that everything looks okay from a technical level, and then we usually assign it to our technical writer, which will look at the consistency and the flow of the documentation. So we can go through these 2, and I'll do that right now. So this one is updating reference for Minio. Anyone who's not familiar, we use Minio for caching. So if you're not familiar with what caching is for GitLab runner, imagine that you have, for example, let's stick with a Node.js application, right? Most of the time you have to run an npm install before you run any tests or any builds, right? And that means you're downloading a bunch of JavaScript packages from the internet. And if you do that for every single job, for every commit you push, that's going to take a really long time, right? Because you have to do an npm, download everything, and over and over. So we have this caching feature where you can cache a specific directory. So you can cache the node modules, for example. And doing so, you don't have to download everything over the internet. And one of the backends, we call it, is using Minio. Let's see what this what this is doing. Admin credentials. So like the first thing I always end up doing is looking at the description and see if there's any related issues to it. Let's see. So okay, so basically what this is saying is when you start a Minio Docker container, it gives you it uses these specific set of default credentials. And for simplicity reasons, we always use those default credentials. But this one, what it seems to be doing is it's updating the Minio username and password, which I agree with. We should try and have the most secure copy-paste kind of commands for users, because Me personally, I do it all the time. I'm not too familiar with these technologies sometimes, so I just copy paste, and then like I kind of I forget to reset it or something like that. So it's always good to make it clear to our users they need to do something to make it secure by default. So let's see what this is doing. So just updating the Docker to start it in background mode and daemon mode. So if we look at Docker run help, let's pipe it to ls. So it's gonna run the container in the background. So I think that is fine. Before we were running it into the foreground. So when the user starts the container, it spits out the logs, and they can't really exit without terminating the container. So I think that's good because the way this Minio container is going to be, it's running in the background in the server somewhere. So I think passing in the -d is good. So this is setting the Minio root pass user and password. If we look at the -e, that is setting an environment variable. So use. Okay. Perfect. So what I usually do in this case, this seems to be correct, and I agree with the change. So what I'm going to do is go into the Markdown file and just act as if I am a user. So I'm just going to copy paste this. I have a Docker for Mac running locally on my laptop, so I can just do this, and I'm gonna pass in. Just let's do it to my temporary directory, so it's removed after I restart my computer, and it's starting a Minio container, right? And I'll just pass in the username, which is hello GitLab. And so this command seems to execute as expected, so that is good. Give it a second to download the container. So if we do a Docker PS, we should expect a mounts denied. Interesting. Might be because I passed the wrong thing, so that's the old container. Let's try it again. So now I have the Minio container running. So if we do a Docker logs and search for Minio, I see that it actually started. So if we go to localhost port 90,000, it does not seem to be working because we are forwarding port 9005. So that is why. So if I zoom in now, I see the secret key and access key, and if I look at, it should be hello GitLab and secure password. So let's try that out. And that worked. So I like this. So to see what we had before, I always try to like enjoy going on our master branch, which is our main branch that we consider as a stable branch. And then let's just run it again to see. So let's first start the menu container. And then remove it. And let's run it. Oh, wonderful. So, okay, so it's this command used to fail as well. So that is good. So it's fixing the command at the same time instead of using the default credentials. Awesome. So I think this looks good. Given that this is just updating the Docker command and one sentence, I feel comfortable merging it myself. So there's always somewhat a judgment call, right? If you want to, if it's a large change, it should always go through the technical documentation. If it's a small change, myself, I can merge it. So I feel comfortable merging this one. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to merge it myself. So thank you so much. So yeah, that should be added to the merge train. It won't be merged immediately. We can see a new pipeline started. So we have a feature at GitLab called merge trains where we run the pipeline on the merge result, meaning the current branch and the master branch merged, to see if it will cause any failures. And this way we can prevent any broken master pipelines. So that will take a while to run. So we can move on to the next merge request that was opened as well. And that was this one. Let's see. Update doc security index. Spelling and grammatical error. So let's see what it is. Yeah. This is like the perfect merge request as well to get started with, right? Like it's just updating a few grammar mistakes. So I'm just gonna approve it and add the train as well. Just because it's small enough and we don't really require a technical writer to check that. So that's it. Yeah, let's see if we have any more merge requests that came in through the hackathon. So we usually use labels for the hackathon, so that is why it's useful. So community contribution and label. Oh, and there's the two that we have currently open, and they are approved and in the merge. So that's good. So unless anyone has any questions or comments they want to go through, I have some other merge requests that I have planned to review.
Give me 1 sec to check again. Okay, nope.
Awesome. So what I had planned to review is 2 community contributions. So the first one is around Kubernetes. So for folks who are not familiar, GitLab Runner can run on multiple types of infrastructures, right? And we call these executors. So imagine that your application is containerized. That means you're most likely using something like Docker, Containerd, or like Kubernetes, for example. And like your CI infrastructure should try and mimic as close as possible to your production environment. So when you run the test, it's close as possible to your production environment, right? So we support multiple execution environments. The most popular ones that we support is the Docker executor. So we're running everything inside of a Docker container with the image that you specified. And we also have the Kubernetes executor, where we run the job inside of a Kubernetes cluster by creating a pod for you, and everything is isolated inside of that pod. So one job is one pod. And the way we do that is talking through the Kubernetes API, for example, for this specific case. And basically, as I said, we create a pod, right, for each job. Now the pod can have multiple containers inside of it. And with Kubernetes, you get a lot of flexibility from a scheduling perspective. So with Kubernetes, you get multiple nodes. So for example, let's say you have a cluster of 3 nodes, so 3 compute servers, I like to call them. And you might want like one of the nodes has a faster disk, or one of the nodes is a different CPU architecture. So like ARM, for example, is very popular nowadays. So you might have a cluster with Intel CPUs and then ARM CPUs. And this specific application that you're running only runs on ARM, for example, right? So you want to make sure that this job only runs on the ARM nodes instead of on the Intel nodes, for example, right? On the x86. So that is where these powerful constructs of Kubernetes come into place regarding scheduling. There's a lot of them. I will not go through them myself, because this is not a Kubernetes tutorial, but it was mostly runner related. So we have what we call affinities. So there are 2 types of affinities. There is let me zoom in a bit, sorry about that. There is a node affinity, and there's also a pod affinity. I will not go into too much detail what's the difference, but basically one of them is selecting where the nodes is going to be scheduled, and then the pods is making sure that one pod is close to the other pod. So like, for example, if you have a Redis server, it should be next to your application server, just so it doesn't go over the network, for example. Those are a few examples. The documentation here, and this URL is, it goes through all the details, so I will not explain everything there, because that can be a whole 2-hour lecture about it. So at the moment, we do support NodeAffinity. So if we open up our runner documentation, so we go to runner, executors, Kubernetes. So if we go to this URL here, we will see all the documentation related to our Kubernetes. So using affinity, so we have, and basically what is this saying is, this GitLab runner, when it creates a pod, it's going to attach this affinity specifications to the job pod, so then it can be scheduled properly. And right now we support NodeAffinity, and all our GitLab runner configuration right now is inside Toml. And that is like a different configuration language, similar to YAML, for example, right? But we have to have the Toml structure, so then we can translate that into the JSON API from Kubernetes. So we send Kubernetes, hey, please create a support with this affinity. So right now we support the NodeAffinity, and this one is adding the PartAffinity and the PartAffinity. So I see config. So we're updating the config, and then we're updating the Kubernetes tests. So one thing, the first thing that pops up into my mind is we're adding a new feature, but we're not adding documentation. One thing that I really like to see is one merge request where if it's adding a new feature, it should be adding documentation. So everything is titled like in one package kind of thing. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes you have to have documentation in a separate merge request. It can be because the merge request is too big, or there is some time pressure, or like in the case of a community contribution, you don't have time to contribute the documentation. So that is something that sometimes we take on. I usually enjoy communicating this with the contributor, because like they might not be familiar that they might not be aware that they had to add documentation. So it's always like a two-way communication, like just, hey, be aware that we need documentation. If you want to add it, you can, but if you don't, we're more than happy to do it. So let me comment on that. I see that we are adding two fields here. Let me link to the documentation, so if they want to update it, they know where to go to. So that is under docs, executors, Kubernetes. So we need the PartAffinity, PartAffinity. So that is one of the things. Let's see what else there is here. So this is not touching the NodeAffinity. Adding a PartAffinity and adding the PartAffinity. Okay. Let me open this up in my editor as well, so we can look at that. So I have an alias in my git config where I do git mr origin and the ID of the mr, and it will automatically clone it for me, which is quite useful to quite useful to for code reviews. And I'm going to try and find it as this alias right here, where it automatically checks out an MR for me. So let me open this in my editor. Let's go to the file that we were looking at here in the common config. And let's search for PartAffinity. So I see that this description is missing. And I feel like we should add it because the description is somewhat important to the users that are trying to configure GitLab Runner, right? And this is also shown in our help documentation. So if you do GitLab Runner register help, and let's search, let's do less. Give it a second to load. There we go. And now if we search for PartAffinity, let's see what there is. We're not showing this in the help command. Interesting. Okay, it might be because, yeah, I think that makes sense. It might be because we're not specifying the env keyword, and we have like some automatic transformation from these fields to that. Let me double check something. Yeah, so yeah, and that makes sense because these structures are not something you can set with environment variables, right? Because these are somewhat complex of a structure. Because it's having like a bunch of nested structure. We usually have like environment variables for values like strings. So for example, let's look at an example. I don't know, the Kubernetes host, for example, where define the Kubernetes API. So if we look at the help command, this again, just to show you an example. We will show you, let me zoom out a bit maybe. Yeah, optional Kubernetes master host URL. When you register a runner, you can pass in the Kubernetes host environment URL, and it will automatically populate the configuration. But since this is a complex structure, it's not just a one field value, so we don't really specify it, allow the user to specify it because it's just confusing at that point. But they still like to have a description, even though we won't be used anywhere, just as a documentation purposes inside of the code, right? So let me comment on that. So. And by the way, what I'm using here, it's called conventional comments. And it's actually a nice way to specify what kind of thing you're talking about in the code review. So for example, if it's a suggestion, if it's a nitpick, if it's blocking or not blocking, if it's a issue that you think it needs to be resolved, and if it's a question, for example, like most of the time it's me asking questions in a code review. So like, hey, why is this like this? And I just prefix it with questions. So the user, like the other person and the other side of the code review knows what I'm trying to get out of this. Or if it's a chore, like, hey, we need to update documentation, or hey, we need to run this script, for example, before we do that. So it's always nice to run through this. And probably what I like the most is the praise, like when you say something nice about the code that was contributed. So So sometimes what I do is like I either give the solution to the user, I keep calling them users and I shouldn't, to the community contributor, or just tell them like, hey, I'll let you figure it out. If you have any issues, reach out to me again. And that is mostly like a, how to say, a case-by-case basis. I've worked with this contributor before, and we have somewhat of a relationship with him. So what I usually do is just point out an issue and he usually fixes it. But if the user is struggling or does not have the time capacity, I usually just give them a solution, and then they just apply it, for example. So it's mostly a case-by-case basis. So that is it on this case. One other interesting thing is we're updating the tests, which is perfect. But what I see is we're not actually updating the Kubernetes itself. So I'm curious how it's updating the response. And that is because, let's see. Let's open it up in my editor. Because basically, this is just the user configuring it, but somehow we have to get all the configuration here and send it to Kubernetes API. So I'm trying to see how that is done right now. And I'm guessing it is part of the get affinity, and that is what it's doing here. So API affinity is the definition from the Kubernetes API. And as we can see, there is NodeAffinity, PartAffinity, and PartAffinity. And I'm guessing the merge request is updating this method. So let's see where that happens. Let's see. Oh, there we go. That's this line here. So basically, we have one function where it's called during the creation of the API request right here, and this parses everything for us. So NodeAffinity is something that we've already been doing, so that is something we don't care about. Now we care about PartAffinity here. So let's go inside of this method and see what it's doing. So get PartAffinity. I expect us to see it in the new methods, and that is what we have here. So let's see. This is just ranging over the required and preferred. So what does this mean? And this is probably the trickiest part about this merge request, right? Making sure that we map our config.toml to be the same as the Kubernetes structure in the API. Now we had discussions with the community to try and make this easier, both from our perspective and our users' perspective, where they just specify the part specification and we just translate it and that's it. But at the moment, we have been doing it on a case-by-case basis, which might not be ideal, but that's what we have right now. So what I like to do is look actually at the API specification here. So it's under the Kubernetes API reference, and I just went to the PartAffinity one. And we have two high-level ones. So preferred during scheduled, ignored during execution, and required during scheduled, ignored during execution. And if we look at our code, that is pretty much what this is, right? So this is the required, and this is the preferred right here. So those two high-level structures are correct. So this is the getting the, and each, for example, let's start with the preferred during scheduling. It has a PartAffinity term, a topology key, a label selector, a namespace, and a weight. So what I expect the user is to be able to set all these inside of the config.toml file. So get PartAffinity term. Let's see what that is doing. That is a label selector, namespace, and a topology key. So topology key. So a few questions come into mind, like where is the weight and so on and so forth. So let's see. Okay, so this is looking at the Kubernetes API, and it specifies a PartAffinity term. And it's a label selector, namespace, and topology key. Okay, that makes sense. And we are, this is about the required, of course. That's why it's not matching. So we're talking about required scheduled during scheduling, sorry. So topology key, label selector, and namespace. That makes a ton of sense. So what is this doing? Get label selector. Label selector. So let's see the API definition of a label selector and make sure it matches. It's the key, the operator, and the values. And I'm guessing this is what we have here. The match labels and the expressions. Now, I'm pretty sure we have a label selector somewhere else. Or is this the first time we're introducing label selector? Yeah. And also feel free to jump into any with any questions that you have at the moment. I'm more than happy to answer. So let's see. So it's specifying the label selector and the PartAffinity. Key operator value. So let's see how this is translating it. So this is creating a requirement. It's looping through all the which expressions. And it's returning the label requirements. Okay, that makes sense. Now, I will not go through all the translation field because that is very boring for you to watch, but I'll go through some other things that I usually do when I review emergence. So the lucky part is we're doing a lot of, we're doing more tests than we're doing actual code, which is nice. But the reason we want to have tests is to have coverage on all the cases that this can go through, right? So what I usually look is at the coverage report. Now, unfortunately, this community contribution is quite old, so I don't think it's going to have the coverage report still available. So, no. Oh, awesome. There it is. So, part of our pipeline is generating the coverage report. So if we look at what we're doing here, and most of our logic is inside of the config.go file. So if we look at common, and I will zoom this soon. Common config. There we go. And this gives us a nice report of like the red part is code that can be covered, but it's not covered. The gray one is code that is not able to be covered by our tests. And the green one is tests that are being covered. And the higher intensity green it is, the more hits we get basically. So the more tests we have covering the scope part, which is something that might be useful to think like if we need more tests, or if one thing, like one line is only being covered by one test, and that might help you think like, oh, should we add more tests or not? So let's look at what we're adding here. So let's start with GetAffinity, for example. And we see we have a few coverage here, but we have one hit actually. So we only have, if you hover on it, it will tell you how many coverage you have. So this is only being tested by one test, which is fine in this case because it's only one test that we need, right? Let's look at the, for example, get label selector. I see this is also being tested, and it's with, and for example here, we see that we added the get PartAffinity. For example, this is a new change we added, but we're not really testing anything about the preferred tiering scheduling ignored. And this is a clear think that, hey, we should probably add tests to this and this merge request so we make sure everything is covered. And this helps me like figure out, okay, what is the state of our test and should we add more coverage? Just a whole philosophy where you should never aim for 100% code coverage, because that does not mean that all your tests and all your edge cases are tested, and it does not mean that your code quality is good either, right? Because sometimes you can you have to go adding a lot more complexities to just get 100% coverage. So it's like mostly a judgment call here as well. Like, should we have coverage or not? Since this is just parsing fields, I would feel a lot more comfortable if we have coverage. So let's see why this is not being covered at all. Let's look at the config test here. Let's open this up. There we go. So we have the pod affinities, but what I do not see is the pod affinities being tested at all. No, there we go. Sorry, I spoke too soon. So preferred during scheduling. So this should be covered because we are testing this part. Sorry, this part. So preferred during scheduling, and the coverage is let's try and generate the report locally and see if that report is accurate. Does not seem to be. Interesting. Just gonna check if this part actually runs from this test, or if I'm misunderstanding something. Yeah, seems like I'm misunderstanding something here. So what is this validate config? What is this getting called? Aha, okay, this is part of the Kubernetes test then, not the config test. Because the config test is just strictly checking the marshalling of the Toml structure. I know we're at time, so I'm gonna pause here to wrap up, but basically what I'm gonna keep looking at is if the translation from our configuration to the Kubernetes API makes sense, and if it's like a one-to-one relationship, making sure we have the right amount of coverage, and also making sure that we have the configuration documented inside of our documentation. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer. We have 3 minutes left, so I can either continue or wrap it up.
I don't see any questions either on YouTube or Gitter or here. So yeah, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, awesome. So just to give a quick overview of what we did, we reviewed 2 merge requests about documentation changes. Those were pretty straightforward. And then we have community contributions like these ones where they're a bit more involved, just because it's either a lot of data structures involved or like a lot of considerations to take into, a lot of factors to take into consideration, basically. We have to keep in mind that if we release the configuration, we have to keep it backwards compatible, because we can't have users updating the GitLab runner version and their old config does not work anymore. So it's something that we have to be careful a lot of the time where we try to add a new configuration. We need to make sure that is something that we can extend in the future and that is correct. Just because if we want to change how that works, we need to make it in a backwards compatible way and make sure we deprecate it slowly and like inform our users. And we usually do deprecations once every year when we create the major releases. So in this case, for example, in 14.0, that is when we can do some breaking changes. And that is always a long and heavy process. And it is by design to be long and heavy, just because we value backwards compatibility a lot. Because like if your code keeps breaking every upgrade, that is not a nice experience for our users. So yeah, that's it, I think.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for participating and watching. See you on the next office hour, which is in 1 hour from now. It's going to be the package group office hour. All right.